The ballroom smelled of beeswax candles, crushed hothouse roses, and the particular desperation of mothers with unmarried daughters. Evangeline Constance Ashworth stood precisely where she always stood at such gatherings. 3 steps behind the potted fern near the east wall, close enough to appear present, invisible enough to be forgotten. She had perfected the art of disappearance over 6 seasons in London. It required only 3 things: a gown of unremarkable color, an expression of polite blankness, and the absolute refusal to want anything loudly enough for anyone to notice. Tonight's gown was sage green, not the fashionable emerald that Lady Cecilia Montrose wore like armor across the room, but the quiet, apologetic green of moss on a forgotten garden wall. Her dark hair was pinned with pearl-tipped pins her mother had pressed into her hands with trembling fingers before the carriage departed Ashworth House. "Try, Evie," her mother had whispered. "Please, this time. Simply try." Evangeline had said nothing. She had learned, over the course of 24 years, that the word try in her mother's vocabulary meant something entirely different from its dictionary definition. It meant, be smaller than you are. Be softer. Be the version of yourself that men find unthreatening. She was very tired of being unthreatening. The Harcastle Ball was the crowning jewel of the season's 2nd month, hosted in the vast, chandelier-dripping splendor of Harcastle House on Grosvenor Square, attended by every name worth whispering in London drawing rooms. 300 guests moved through the gilded rooms like a tide of silk and ambition, the women sparkling in their finest jewels, the men clustering near the card room or the decanting tables with the practiced ease of those who owned the world and knew it. The string quartet in the far corner played a lively Haydn piece that nobody listened to. Scandal sheets changed hands behind ivory fans. Introductions were made and unmade within the same breath. A young officer near the refreshment table laughed too loudly at something a viscount's wife had said, and 3 matrons turned to assess him with identical expressions of barely concealed disdain. Evangeline watched all of it with the quiet, decataloguing attention she had never been able to suppress. The attention that her mother called unseemly and her late father had called her greatest gift. She noticed the slight tremor in Lady Harcastle's hand as she greeted guests, suggesting the hostess had taken wine rather earlier than the evening warranted. She noticed the young debutante near the window, a pretty, golden-haired creature introduced earlier as Miss Penelope Forsyth, whose smile had not once reached her eyes, whose gaze kept sliding toward the door with the particular hunger of someone waiting for a specific person to walk through it. She noticed, too, the moment the room changed. It was not dramatic. There was no fanfare, no sudden silencing of conversation. It was more subtle than that. A ripple, yet moving outward from the main entrance, like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-flutter. The laughter near the card-room doorway died to murmurs, and then she saw him. He was tall in the way that commanded architecture, as though rooms adjusted themselves around him rather than the reverse. He wore black superfine with a white cravat tied in a mathematical perfection that suggested either a very skilled valet or a man who cared enough about his own presentation to oversee every detail personally. Dark hair, cut short at the sides and left slightly longer at the crown. A jaw that appeared to have been carved by someone with a grudge against softness. But it was not his appearance that changed the room's temperature. It was the way he moved through it. Lord Caius Remington Blackwell, the 6th Duke of Ashenmore, decrossed the ballroom floor as though the 300 people between him and his destination were minor inconveniences he had already dismissed. He did not stop to greet. He did not smile. He offered the precise minimum of acknowledgement required by social law. A nod here, a slight incline of the head there. And he did it all with the efficient coldness of a man conducting business rather than attending a celebration. Evangeline had heard of him, of course. One could not spend 6 seasons in London without hearing of the Duke of Ashenmore. The Ton spoke of him in 2 registers. The odd whisper used for the genuinely powerful, and the faintly scandalized undertone reserved for those who refused to play society's games with any visible enjoyment. Brilliant, they said. Cold as a January grave, but rebuilt the Ashenmore estates from near ruin in 4 years. No interest in marriage, no interest in society, no discernible interest in anything that does not return a measurable profit. He had been abroad, the continent, someone had said, though the nature of his business there was never specified in polite company, which meant it was either governmental or disgraceful, and with men like Blackwell, the 2 categories were not always distinct. He had returned to London 3 weeks ago. The marriage market had not recovered. Evangeline watched him take a glass of champagne from a passing footman without breaking stride, survey the room with the comprehensive disinterest of a general assessing terrain he had already decided was beneath his full attention. And then, with the terrible precision of a man who always knew exactly where he was going, begin to move in the direction of the east wall. In the direction, Evangeline realized with a cold drop of her stomach, of the potted fern. Of her. She did not move. Moving would have been conspicuous, and conspicuous was the one thing she could not afford tonight. Not with her mother's desperate eyes tracking her from across the room. Not with the particular fragility of the Ashworth finances that had made this season not a social exercise, but a quiet, suffocating emergency. He stopped 4 feet away from her. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the room, that same comprehensive, cold survey, but he had stopped in her precise vicinity, and Evangeline became suddenly acutely aware of the sage green gown, the pearl pins, the unremarkable presentation she had constructed so carefully. He will not notice you, she told herself. No one ever does. You have been standing in the same position for 47 minutes. His voice was low, not warm. Warmth was clearly a register he had not bothered to cultivate, but resonant in a way that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and arrive somewhere behind the sternum. Evangeline turned her head slowly. He was still looking at the room. "I beg your pardon?" she said. 47 minutes, he repeated, since the second set began. You have not danced. You have not sought refreshment. You have declined 2 separate introductions. The first from Lady Harcastle's niece, the second from a captain, someone whose name I did not catch. You have simply stood here. A pause. Watching. The precision of his observation should have been unsettling. Somehow it was not. It was, Evangeline thought with some surprise, the most accurately she had been seen in 6 years of London seasons. And you, she said carefully, have apparently been watching me watch. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. She would learn later that the Duke of Ashenmore did not smile the way ordinary people smiled, that his version of the expression was a fractional, almost imperceptible softening at the corners of a mouth, otherwise kept in a condition of severe composure. But something. He turned his head and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were gray, not the romantic silver gray of Gothic novels, but the true gray of winter sky over the Thames, cool, deep, containing the suggestion of weather to come. You are not here to dance, he said. It was not a question. Neither, it appears, are you. Another fractional shift. No, he agreed. I am not. A beat of silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual. Silence at balls was almost always uncomfortable. It was filled with the awareness of what one should be doing instead: dancing, conversing, being assessed and found adequate or wanting by the watchful machinery of society. This silence felt different. It felt like two people standing slightly outside the machinery, observing it together. You know who I am, he said. Another non-question. The Duke of Ashenmore. She paused. You returned from the continent 3 weeks ago. Your estates in Northumberland were reportedly in significant disrepair when you inherited, and they are now considered among the most productive in the north of England. You are 31 years old. You have been invited to approximately 40 social engagements since your return and attended, by my count, 7. She met his gaze steadily, including this one. The gray eyes were very still. And you, he said slowly, are not what you are pretending to be. The words landed with quiet precision, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was visible. Before she could formulate a response, before she could reconstruct the pleasant, unremarkable blankness that was her social armor, a voice cut across the room like a blade through silk. Good God! Has Ashenmore actually found something worth looking at in this insipid gathering? The voice belonged to Lord Phineas Deverill, Viscount Stanhope, a second son of the Earl of Castlemore, and the particular species of English aristocrat that Evangeline had spent 6 seasons carefully avoiding. Beautiful, bored, and possessed of the casual cruelty that comes from never having been denied anything of consequence. He was golden where Blackwell was dark, easy where Blackwell was precise, and he moved through the ballroom with the loose confidence of a man who had never once considered that a room might not be arranged for his comfort. He was flanked by 2 other gentlemen, whose names Evangeline did not know and did not want to. They had the identical air of satellites orbiting a careless sun, reflecting his light, amplifying his noise. He stopped beside Blackwell and looked at Evangeline. The look was comprehensive, unhurried, and entirely devoid of any recognition of her as a person rather than an object of momentary interest. It was the look, she had learned, that a certain type of man gave a woman he was deciding whether to bother with. The assessment took approximately 4 seconds. She watched his conclusion arrive in his expression like a door closing. Ah, he said. The Wallflower Brigade. He raised his glass in a lazy, mocking salute that was not quite a toast. Tell me, Ashenmore, do you make a habit of rescuing the overlooked? I had not heard altruism among your many reported virtues. One of his companions laughed. The other had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which suggested he was new to Deverill's particular circle and had not yet fully calcified. Evangeline felt the familiar cold settle over her, the social chill of public humiliation, the particular vulnerability of being made small in front of witnesses. She had felt it before. She had learned to absorb it without visible flinching, to let it pass through her like cold water, to keep her expression composed and her chin level. She was composing herself now. She was keeping her chin level. Blackwell had gone very still beside her. Deverill, he said. Just the name. Nothing else. Come now. Don't be grim about it. Deverill's gaze slid back to Evangeline with renewed interest. The interest, she understood, of a man who had just noticed that someone else appeared to value an object he had dismissed. I don't believe we've been introduced. Phineas Deverill, Viscount Stanhope. A bow so slight it was nearly an insult. And you are? Miss Ashworth, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Ashworth. He turned the name over as though testing its weight and finding it insufficient. Ashworth. That is, the Somerset Ashworths? The late Sir Edmund Ashworth's family. Something shifted in his expression. A new quality of attention, sharper and less pleasant than what had preceded it. The bankrupt Ashworths. The word landed in the small silence between them like a stone through glass. It was not entirely accurate. Her father's estate was encumbered, not ruined. There was a distinction, and it mattered enormously. But accuracy had never been Deverell's particular interest. His interest was the reaction, the flinch, the color rising in a woman's cheeks, the downward dart of eyes, or the confirmation that he had found the soft place and pressed it successfully. Evangeline did not flinch. She looked at him with the steady, cataloging attention she had been born with and refined over 24 years of careful observation. And she said, in a voice of absolute composure, "The Somerset Ashworths, yes. Though I confess I am not familiar with which branch of the Deverell family makes a habit of discussing other families' financial circumstances at a ball. Is that a Castlemore tradition, or a personal innovation?" A beat of absolute silence. Deverell stared at her. His two companions exchanged a glance, and then Deverell's expression transformed. The easy cruelty retreating, replaced by something considerably more focused and considerably less casual. The bored lion, Evangeline thought, she discovering that the mouse had teeth. "Well," he said softly, "how entirely unexpected." "Is it?" She held his gaze. "I imagine most things are unexpected when one stops paying attention." "Evie." The voice came from behind her left shoulder, her mother's voice, arriving with the particular quality of suppressed panic that Evangeline had been hearing all season. Lady Ashworth materialized beside her daughter with the speed of a woman who had been monitoring this exchange from across the room with mounting horror. "Lord Stanhope," her mother said, deploying her company smile with desperate professionalism. "What a pleasure. And, oh." Her voice altered entirely as she registered Blackwell's presence. "Your Grace, what an honor. I am Lady Ashworth, Evangeline's mother. I cannot tell you what a... Mama." Evangeline's voice was gentle but firm. Her mother stopped, looked at her daughter, read something in Evangeline's expression that caused her to swallow whatever she had been about to say next. Deverell had not taken his eyes off Evangeline. "Any heiress here?" he said, and the tone was different now. The mockery sharpened to something with an edge, something designed to draw a specific kind of blood. He swept a look around the gathered witnesses. There were 6 now, 7, drawn by the particular magnetism of social tension, the ton's unfailing appetite for the spectacle of someone being reduced. "I am told the Ashworths have a daughter of considerable prospects." The pause before considerable stretched just long enough to make its falseness unmistakable. Perhaps she might enlighten us as to the precise nature of these prospects. The ton does love a mystery. Laughter, soft, poisonous, rippled through the small audience. Lady Ashworth had gone pale. Evangeline felt something shift inside her chest. Not the cold absorption she had cultivated. Not the practiced composure. Something older and harder and considerably less patient. Something that had been building quietly for 6 years of standing behind potted ferns in unremarkable gowns. 6 years of being unthreatening. 6 years of try, Evie, please. She reached into the small silk reticule hanging from her wrist. Her fingers found the letter. She had carried it for 3 weeks. She had not known, precisely, why she carried it. whether it was hope or habit, or the particular instinct of a woman who had learned to keep her most important things close, where they could not be taken from her. She withdrew it now. The paper was heavy, the quality of stationery available only to those at the very summit of English society. The seal had been broken, but was still recognizable, a phoenix rising from a coronet, rendered in black wax, the Ashenmore seal. She unfolded it. She did not look at Blackwell. She was not certain she could afford to, not yet, not with the ground shifting beneath her in the way it was shifting. She looked at Deverell, and she read, in a clear, carrying voice that cut through the string quartet and the whispers and the crystalline clink of champagne glasses. She read the letter that the Duke of Ashenmore had written to her father 6 months ago, before her father's death. Before everything had fractured and reformed into this desperate, brittle season, she read the letter in which the Duke of Ashenmore had written, in his precise, unornamented hand, that Sir Edmund Ashworth was a man of the most exceptional integrity and sound judgment he had encountered in his considerable experience. That the Ashworth family's financial difficulties were the result of catastrophic misfortune rather than mismanagement. That any gentleman of discernment would consider an alliance with the Ashworth family not a condescension, but an elevation. She read the letter in which a duke had, quietly and without audience, defended a dying man's honor. The ballroom had gone entirely silent. The string quartet, she noticed distantly, had stopped playing. She folded the letter, replaced it in her reticule, raised her eyes to the audience that had gathered, 7 people, 8, 10, cut the ripples spreading outward again, and said nothing further. She did not need to. The room belonged to her. She had not slept. This was not unusual. Evangeline had never been a reliable sleeper, her mind preferring the quiet hours of darkness to pursue the thoughts it had been too occupied to fully examine during the day. But last night's insomnia had a different quality from its customary form. It was not the productive wakefulness of a mind working through problems. It was the bright, uncomfortable alertness of someone who had done something irreversible and was only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of what it meant. She sat at the writing desk in her bedroom at Ashworth House, a house that smelled, permanently now, of the particular mustiness of rooms that could not afford to be redecorated, of old wood and cold hearths and the ghost of better decades. And she watched the gray London dawn assemble itself outside the window, and she thought about the Duke of Ashenmore's face when she had read his letter aloud to a room of 300 people. He had not moved. That was the thing she kept returning to. Most men, she thought, would have reacted, would have shown surprise or anger or the particular variety of male displeasure that comes from being acted upon rather than acting. But Blackwell had gone very still, in the way of something with enormous force contained within it, and he had watched her read his private correspondence to the assembled flower of London society, and his expression had been, she searched for the right word, assessing. Not angry, not surprised, assessing. As though she were a variable in an equation, he was revising in real time. Deverell had left shortly after. He had recovered. Men like Deverell always recovered, their social resilience being a function of their impermeability to shame. But he had left, and his 2 companions had followed, and the audience had dispersed, and the string quartet had resumed its Haydn. And Evangeline had stood in the wreckage of what she had done and understood with absolute clarity that she had not, in fact, made anything simpler. The letter had silenced Deverell, yes. It had done what she had intended, or what she had intended in the 3 seconds between his cruelty and her action, which was perhaps not the same as a properly considered intention. It had defended her family's name in a room where her family's name needed defending. But it had also announced, to everyone present, that the Duke of Ashenmore had a prior connection to the Ashworth family. That he had written to her father with something that could, to a sufficiently motivated observer, be read as warmth. That the unremarkable wallflower in the sage green gown was carrying his private correspondence in her reticule. By morning, every scandal sheet in London would have a version of last night. By afternoon, the drawing-room whispers would have a dozen interpretations. By the end of the week, a knock at her bedroom door interrupted the calculation. Miss Evie. The voice of Parks, their housekeeper, a woman of 60 who had served the Ashworths for 30 years and showed no sign of abandoning the practice despite the increasingly theoretical nature of her salary. There is a caller, miss, in the front parlor. Evangeline looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 20 minutes past 7 in the morning. A caller, she repeated. Yes, miss. A pause that contained volumes. A gentleman caller. He arrived in a very large carriage. He was standing when she entered the parlor, standing at the window, his back to her, watching the street below with the same comprehensive attention he had turned on the ballroom. He had come, apparently, directly from wherever dukes went after balls. He was still in his black superfine, the mathematical cravat only marginally less precise than it had been 12 hours earlier, which suggested either that he had not slept or that his valet operated on a schedule that defied ordinary human rhythms. He turned when she entered. In the thin morning light of an underfurnished parlor, without the architecture of a grand ballroom around him, he looked different. Not smaller, nothing about the Duke of Ashenmore suggested smallness, but more present, more real. The ballroom had given him the quality of a portrait. The parlor gave him edges. Miss Ashworth, he said. Your Grace. She did not sit. Neither did he. This is an early call. I am an early riser. He looked at her with those Winter River eyes. You read my letter. I did. To 300 people. Closer to 250, I believe. The far end of the room may not have heard the entirety. Something moved in his expression. That fractional, almost not there softening. I see, he said. And did you consider, before you did so, that private correspondence is called private for reasons that are generally considered self-explanatory? I considered it, she said. I concluded that the circumstances warranted an exception. The circumstances. He repeated the phrase with the careful neutrality of a man who was choosing not to inflect it with the several possible meanings available to him. Lord Stanhope made an unpleasant remark. Lord Stanhope made a calculated public attack on my family's reputation in a room full of witnesses. She kept her voice level. He has done similar things before, in smaller gatherings, where it cost less. I decided that last night was the moment to establish a different pattern. Using my letter. Using the truth, she said. Your letter contained the truth. My father was a man of integrity. Our difficulties were the result of misfortune. Those facts needed to be spoken in that room, last night, by something other than my own voice. Because my voice, in that room, carried the weight of self-interest. Your letter carried the weight of disinterest. The weight of a man who had nothing to gain by writing it and wrote it anyway. A long silence. Blackwell looked at her with an attention so concentrated it had a physical quality, like standing in direct sunlight. You knew the letter was from me, he said slowly. Before last night. You knew the seal. I have been carrying it for 3 weeks. Why? It was the question she had been asking herself since 2 in the morning. She answered it the only way she could, honestly, because she had discovered that dishonesty in front of this particular man would be not only futile, but somehow actively distasteful, like bringing inferior wine to a table where better was expected. Because it was the only kind thing anyone said about my father after he died, she said, and I was not ready to put it away. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Blackwell crossed the room, not quickly, but with the deliberate, measured movement that seemed to characterize everything he did, and stopped at a distance that was correct by every social convention, and felt, somehow, like considerably less than the room's full width. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I will need you to understand something." She waited. "What happened last night will have consequences." His voice was careful, not unkind, but precise in the way of someone delivering information they consider it their obligation to convey accurately. "The Ton will have constructed a narrative by now. I suspect you are aware of what that narrative will be. That you have an interest in my family. That I have an interest in you." He held her gaze. "Specifically. The kind of interest that brings a duke to a woman's parlor at 7 in the morning, the day after a public spectacle involving his private correspondence." Evangeline felt her pulse do something it had no business doing. She kept her expression composed. "And do you," she asked, "have such an interest?" The gray eyes were very steady. "I have," he said, "an interest in understanding what I am dealing with." A pause. "You are not what you appear to be. You established that last night to everyone present. I would like to understand what you actually are." "I am Sir Edmund Ashworth's daughter," she said. "I am 24 years old, which makes me, by the Ton's reckoning, firmly on the shelf. I have 6 years of London seasons behind me, and nothing to show for them except an education in human nature that I could not have purchased at any price. I am not an heiress, whatever Deverell intended by that word. I am a woman of modest prospects, considerable intelligence, and a family situation that makes this season not a pleasure, but a necessity." She paused. "I am also the woman who read your letter to 250 people, and I will not apologize for it. Though I understand I owe you an explanation." Blackwell was quiet for a long moment. "The explanation," he said, "was the conversation we are currently having." She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I came this morning for an explanation. You have provided one." He moved toward the door, then stopped, with his hand not quite on the handle, and turned back with the air of a man making a decision that he has already made and is now simply implementing. "There is a matter of business I require assistance with. It involves correspondence, a significant quantity of it, in French and Italian, pertaining to property negotiations on the continent. My secretary reads neither language with sufficient fluency for the nuance required." Evangeline stared at him. "You read French and Italian," he said. It was not a question. "And German," she said, slightly dazed. "My father believed in comprehensive education." "Your father," Blackwell said, "was correct." He opened the parlor door. "Mas, I will send the first correspondence this afternoon," he said. "My secretary will include the relevant context. If the arrangement proves workable, we can discuss a more formal engagement." He was at the hallway now. Evangeline followed, because she was apparently following, her mind 3 steps behind her feet. "You are offering me employment?" she said. He paused on the threshold, looked back at her with those gray, weather-containing eyes. "I am offering you," he said carefully, "a reason to be seen in my company that society will find less interesting than the alternative they have currently constructed. A beat. And yes, employment. At a rate considerably above what your situation would allow you to negotiate independently." He held her gaze. "Is there an objection?" Evangeline thought about her mother's pale face last night, on the musty parlor, the cold hearths, the ghost of better decades. "No," she said, "there is no objection." The Duke of Ashenmore nodded, a single, precise movement, and stepped into the London morning. The door closed behind him. Evangeline stood in the hall of Ashworth House and pressed her fingers to her sternum, where her pulse was conducting itself with absolutely no regard for her composure, and stared at the closed door for a long moment. Then she went upstairs to find her French dictionary. The correspondence arrived that afternoon, as promised. It arrived in a leather satchel borne by a footman in the Ashenmore livery, black and silver, immaculate, who delivered it with the gravity of someone transporting dispatches to a field general. The satchel contained 43 letters in French, 17 in Italian, a brief note in English from a Mr. Aldous Kemp identifying himself as His Grace's secretary, outlining the relevant context with an efficiency that suggested he had been told to be thorough, and a separate folded piece of paper with no salutation and no signature that contained only the words, "Take whatever time is necessary. Accuracy matters more than speed." Evangeline read the last note 3 times. She told herself this was because she was looking for instructions. She was not entirely convinced by this explanation. She spread the French correspondence across the writing desk and began to read. The letters were from a Monsieur Edouard Valette, a Parisian lawyer of apparently considerable reputation, pertaining to the negotiation of a property sale in the Loire Valley, a former estate of the pre-revolutionary French nobility that had passed through several hands during the chaos of the previous decades, and was now available for acquisition at a price that Valette, with Gallic obliqueness, was attempting to establish as both fixed and negotiable simultaneously. The Italian correspondence was from a Contessa di Miraval in Venice, involving a palazzo of medieval origins and what appeared to be a genuinely labyrinthine dispute over water rights with a neighboring family that had been ongoing, according to the earliest letter, since approximately 1743. Evangeline read carefully. She made notes. She identified the places where Valette was obscuring his meaning behind legal terminology that would read differently to a native speaker than to someone translating mechanically. The places where the politeness was a negotiating posture. The places where the apparent flexibility masked a hard boundary. She wrote her translations with commentary. She could not help the commentary. Her father had taught her that language was not transparent, that every word choice was a choice, that understanding what someone meant required understanding what they were doing with language, not merely what they were saying. She noted where Valette was flattering, where the Contessa was threatening, where the formal Italian of the water rights dispute concealed what was, at bottom, two families who had hated each other for 80 years and were using legal language to prosecute a war that had no other battlefield. She worked until the candles needed replacing, and her mother appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea and an expression of barely contained anxiety. "The Duke of Ashenmore's footman," her mother said, setting the tea down with the careful precision of a woman who was constructing her approach as she went. "The satchel." "Yes, Mama." "He has offered you," Mr. Kemp's note said, "translation work." "Yes." Evangeline. Her mother sat in the chair across the desk. In the candlelight, she looked older than she had a year ago, the anxiety of the last 12 months having settled into the fine lines around her eyes, with a permanence that grieved Evangeline every time she looked directly at it. What is happening? Evangeline set down her pen. I am not entirely certain, she said honestly, but I believe it is something that might help us. The ton is saying, I know what the ton is saying. They are saying that Ashenmore has taken an interest. Her mother's voice was careful. That kind of interest. Evangeline was quiet for a moment. He came this morning to understand what had happened last night, she said. He left with an arrangement of a professional nature. That is all it is. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, with the complicated, layered look of a woman who had been navigating the gap between what things were and what they appeared to be for 30 years of married life. Be careful, Evie, she said quietly. Men like that. I know. Men like that do not notice wallflowers. No, Evangeline agreed. They notice women who read their private correspondence aloud to 250 people. A pause. Her mother made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh. Your father would have been appalled, she said. Papa would have been delighted, Evangeline said. And you know it. Her mother's expression shifted into something softer, more grief-touched. She reached across the desk and pressed Evangeline's hand briefly. The grip of a woman who had loved her daughter's fierce, inconvenient intelligence, even when it terrified her. Finish your translations, she said. Don't sit up past midnight. She left. Evangeline looked at the candle flame for a moment, thinking of her father's voice saying your greatest gift, thinking of the Duke of Ashenmore's gray eyes saying I am dealing with you, thinking of the particular and dangerous feeling of being genuinely, accurately seen for the first time in a very long while. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the Contessa's water rights. The arrangement, as it turned out, was not as simple as the correspondence delivered by footmen. Within a fortnight, Mr. Kemp had, with what Evangeline was beginning to recognize as the Duke's characteristic efficiency in disposing of any obstacle between himself and what he required, arranged for Evangeline to work from the Ashenmore House Library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. More efficient, Mr. Kemp's note explained, for the occasions when His Grace requires immediate clarification. The Ashenmore House Library was a room designed to communicate without vulgarity the comprehensive superiority of its owner's intellectual resources. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fireplace large enough to stand in, 2 reading tables of dark walnut, and a collection of maps framed on the 4th wall that appeared to span, conservatively, the whole of the known world. It smelled of leather bindings and wood smoke, and the faint, good mustiness of books that were actually read rather than purchased for display. Evangeline loved it immediately and without reservation, which she considered unwise and did anyway. Blackwell was not always present on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He appeared, she came to understand, when he had questions, when the correspondence raised issues that required context she had not been given, or when Valette's Gallic obliqueness had reached levels that even her annotations could not fully illuminate. He would appear in the library doorway, exchange the minimum number of words necessary to extract the information he required, and withdraw. Gradually, the minimum number of words increased. She was never certain, afterward, and exactly when this happened, or which of them had initiated it. It seemed, in retrospect, like something that had occurred in increments too small to observe directly. The way water carves stone, or the way light changes in autumn, so gradually that one only notices when it is already complete. He asked her, one Thursday afternoon in October, what she thought of Valette's most recent letter. Not for the translation, but for her assessment of the man. She told him. She told him that Valette was not obstructing the negotiation for financial reasons, but for reasons of personal sentiment. That the property in the Loire had belonged to his wife's family before the Revolution, and that the obliqueness of his correspondence masked not legal complexity, but grief. A man being paid to help sell something that he felt should not be sold at all, and conducting the transaction with all the unconscious resistance of a person doing something that violated their own conscience. Blackwell had been still for a long moment. That, he had said, is not in the letters. It is between them, she said. He had looked at her with that concentrated sunlight attention. What would you recommend? He had said. She had blinked. In 6 years of London seasons, no one had ever asked her what she would recommend. Write to him directly, she said, when she had recovered herself. Not through the legal formalities. Acknowledge the history. Tell him you understand what you are asking him to do. Men who feel unacknowledged in their pain obstruct. Men who feel seen cooperate. Blackwell had said nothing. He had left the library. 3 days later, she received a translation request for a reply to Valette. Blackwell had written to him in precisely the way she had suggested, not using her words, which would have been unlike him in any case, but the approach, the acknowledgement, the recognition of the human cost behind the legal process. Valette's next letter had moved the negotiation forward 3 months in a single communication. She had felt, reading Mr. Kemp's accompanying note, something warm and complicated and entirely inadvisable. The difficulty was that proximity, as any sensible woman knew, was dangerous. Proximity to a man like Caius Blackwell was not the comfortable, dimly pleasurable proximity of a ballroom acquaintance, the kind where one thought he is handsome and filed it away behind propriety and moved on. It was the sharp, specific proximity of a working relationship, where she saw him tired and frustrated, and occasionally wrong, and occasionally more right than she had anticipated, and where he, she was quite certain, saw her in equal detail. She saw him argue with his man of business, Mr. Crowe, about the Northumberland estate accounts, not with the theatrical displeasure of a man performing authority, but with the focused, technical precision of someone who understood the numbers and found an error that Crowe had missed. She saw him read, with apparent genuine absorption, a French philosophical text she had left on the reading table that had nothing to do with the Valette correspondence. She saw him once, standing at the library window in the late afternoon light, reading a letter that was clearly not business. His posture different, still something unguarded briefly present. And she had turned away from the doorway before he could see her, because some things were not hers to witness. She also saw him, 3 weeks into the arrangement, come to the library with a bruise developing under his left eye and his cravat more approximately tied than its usual mathematical standard, and say nothing about it whatsoever. Simply sit down, open the correspondence, and begin asking questions as though nothing had occurred. She had translated 2 letters before she said, without looking up from the Italian, "Deverell." A pause. "I beg your pardon?" His voice was carefully neutral. "The bruise. Deverell." Another pause. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. "We had a disagreement," he said. "About?" The gray eyes held hers for a moment. "Show about a matter that concerns a mutual acquaintance," he said. "It has been resolved." Something in the economy of this response told her it had been resolved in the way that men of Blackwell's type resolved things. Directly, physically, and without the involvement of anyone else. She thought of Deverell's face at the Harcastle ball. The particular quality of his cruelty, targeted, practiced, aimed at the precise location most likely to leave a mark. "He came after you because of me," she said. It was not a question. "He came after me because he is the kind of man who cannot leave anything unpunished," Blackwell said. "The specific catalyst is irrelevant." "It is not irrelevant to me." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it is not." The afternoon light lay across the reading table between them. Outside, the October London traffic was its usual cacophony. Horses, carriage wheels, the shouts of street vendors, the whole enormous, indifferent machinery of the city. Inside the library, something was very still. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was different. Not the precise professional register. Not the economical question and answer of their working sessions. Something underneath it. Something that required careful handling. "Your Grace," she said. "Equally careful." He looked down at the correspondence on the table, back at her. The gray eyes had something in them that she recognized because she had felt it herself. The specific discomfort of a feeling that did not fit within the available categories. "This arrangement," he said slowly, "has proven productive," she offered. "Yes. A beat. 'Tis more than that." She did not trust herself to speak. "I find—" He stopped, started again. For the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Ashenmore appeared to be searching for words. This, she thought, is what he looks like when he does not know what he is dealing with. "I find that your presence in this house on Tuesdays and Thursdays is something I have—" Another stop. "Something I am aware of. On the other days." The library was very quiet. "I see," she said. "That is not—" He exhaled. A short, controlled breath. The kind that suggested he was managing something. "I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean, Miss Ashworth. But I am equally not in the habit of saying things without understanding their full implications." He met her gaze directly. "I wished you to know that I am considering the implications." Evangeline looked at him. The strong-boned face in the October afternoon light, the bruise beneath his eye, the slightly imperfect cravat, the gray eyes containing their weather, and felt something she had spent years constructing walls against move quietly through every wall she had built. "I see," she said again. And then, because she was her father's daughter, "I am considering them as well." November arrived in London with fog and consequence. The Ashenmore-Ashworth connection had been, predictably, the Tun's primary entertainment for the preceding 6 weeks. The scandal sheets had been, on the whole, kinder than Evangeline had anticipated. There was something about the ballroom letter incident that had struck the public imagination favorably, the narrative of the overlooked woman who had produced, from apparent nowhere, a duke's private defense of her family. It was a good story. People liked good stories, even the people whose primary occupation was tearing them apart. But November brought Lord Phineas Deverell's counter-narrative. She heard it first from Lady Harcastle's niece, Miss Georgiana Webb, a kind-hearted young woman who had sought Evangeline out specifically to warn her, which Evangeline found touching and alarming in equal measure. "He is saying," Georgiana said, in the low, urgent voice of someone conveying information they wish they did not have to convey. That the letter was fabricated. That Miss Ashworth obtained His Grace's stationery by irregular means, and constructed the letter herself, and to create exactly the impression it created. Evangeline went very still. "He has no evidence for this claim," she said. "No," Georgiana agreed. "But he has friends in the press, and there is apparently a gentleman, a Mr. Calloway, who says he was present when who says he saw you with Ashenmore's secretary in circumstances that were—" Georgiana stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "That were not professional." "That is a lie," Evangeline said flatly. "I know," said Georgiana. "I believe you. But Evie—" She caught herself, colored slightly at the familiarity. "Miss Ashworth, if this reaches the papers, if it becomes the established story, then the letter's defense of her family's honor became instead evidence of deception. If it became the established story, so the arrangement with Blackwell, already balanced on the knife edge of social acceptability, became a scandal of the worst kind. If it became the established story, her mother's pale, anxious face would have its worst fears confirmed in print. She thanked Georgiana. She went home. She sat in the musty parlor and thought with the cold, comprehensive clarity that came to her in genuine crises, when the ordinary noise of anxiety was replaced by something quieter and more efficient. Deverell had not attacked Blackwell successfully, so he was attacking her. She was, in his calculation, the weaker target. She thought about whether he was correct. She arrived at Ashenmore House the following Thursday, not on the usual business schedule, not with her translation satchel, but at 4 p.m, without announcement, and told the butler she would wait. Blackwell appeared within 10 minutes, which she interpreted as evidence that he had been informed and chosen to come quickly. He was in shirt sleeves, clearly interrupted from something that had not required formality, which was such a departure from his customary immaculate presentation that she found herself noting it with a clarity her present circumstances did not really have room for. "I know about Deverell's story," she said, before he could speak. "I know about Calloway." Blackwell's expression was absolutely controlled. "Yes," he said. "Calloway works for Deverell." "Yes. You knew before I did. I learned this morning." His voice was careful. "I was considering how to proceed before speaking to you." "How to proceed?" she repeated. "Your Grace." She held his gaze with the steady, but difficult courage that had served her at the Harcastle ball and was serving her now, though it cost considerably more on this occasion. "If this story takes hold, it does not merely damage me. It implicates you. It suggests that your household, was used as an instrument of deception. It attaches scandal to your name." "I am aware." "Then you also understand that the arrangement we have—" She paused. "The practical thing, the sensible thing, the thing that a man in your position, with your responsibilities, with the weight of a dukedom—" "Miss Ashworth." His voice had an edge. "Would logically do," she continued, because she had started this and she would finish it, "is to distance himself from the source of the difficulty, to allow it to be understood that the arrangement was professional, brief, and has concluded. Into— Stop." She stopped. He crossed the room. That deliberate, measured crossing, that refusal to be hurried, and stopped at a distance that was not, this time, calibrated to social convention. It was closer than convention permitted, It was the distance of intention. "I will not distance myself from you," he said. His voice was very quiet. "It would be the rational choice," she said. Her own voice was not entirely steady. This was a new failure of composure. She noted it with the part of her mind that was always noting things, and set it aside. "Perhaps." He looked at her with those gray, weather-containing eyes. "I find that certain calculations change when the variables are not abstract." "That is—" She sought words. "That is very unlike you, Your Grace." "Yes," he said, "it is." The afternoon light in the hallway was the particular gold of late autumn, the last warmth before the cold fully arrived. The house around them was quietly expensive, carefully maintained. Outside, the fog was beginning to come off the Thames. "There is something you do not know," he said. She waited. "The letter I wrote to your father." He paused. "The one you read at the Harcastle ball." Another pause, longer. "I wrote it because I knew your father, not as a business acquaintance, though that was the public nature of our connection. Because 30 years ago, when my father's estates were in a different variety of ruin, a ruin of his own making, the kind that does not attract sympathy, it was Edmund Ashworth who defended my family in circumstances not unlike those in which you defended yours." He held her gaze steadily. He was a young man, a barely established baronet with nothing to gain and a great deal to lose. He spoke in a room full of people who had already decided their position in favor of a family that society had already condemned. Evangeline felt something shift in her chest, something vast and quiet, the movement of tectonic things. "He never told me," she whispered. "He would not have," Blackwell said. "That was the nature of the man, a beat. When I heard he had died, when I understood the situation your family was in, I wrote the letter because it was the only thing I had to offer. I had no way of knowing whether it would ever serve any purpose." "It served every purpose," she said. "Yes," he said softly. "It did. Chateau because his daughter carried it in her reticule for 3 weeks and read it at precisely the right moment." Something in his expression shifted into that almost smile, with considerable panache, I am told. A sound escaped her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was, perhaps, both. "Deverell's story," she said, when she had recovered herself. "What are we going to do about it?" The "we" landed between them, and neither of them addressed it, and both of them heard it. "I have 3 options," Blackwell said. His voice had returned to its precise register, but there was something underneath it now that she heard differently. "I can produce documentary evidence that Calloway's claim is false. I have the original correspondence in my own hand, and my secretary can testify to the circumstances in which the letter was written. I can also present Valette's recent communication to my solicitors as evidence of the legitimate working arrangement." A pause. "Or I can make the arrangement between us one that Deverell cannot attack, one that removes the question entirely." Evangeline went very still. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "The third option," he said, "is one that I would not raise without your consent, without your understanding that it is not proposed as a tactical solution, that it is proposed because the variables have changed, and I am not willing to pretend otherwise." The gray eyes were very direct. "Because I am, it turns out, not very good at pretending when it comes to things that matter." Outside, a carriage passed. The fog thickened against the windows. The autumn gold of the hallway light deepened toward amber. "That," Evangeline said softly, is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." "I have always been honest with you," he said. "This is the first time honesty has required courage rather than simply precision." She looked at him, the strong-boned face, the gray eyes, the slight imperfection that living had given to the otherwise architectural structure of the Duke of Ashenmore, and she thought about her father, who had spoken in a room full of people who had already decided. She thought about what it cost to speak, and what it cost to stay silent, and which of those costs was the one she was least willing to pay. "We should discuss it properly," she said. "The third option. There are things you do not know about my situation." "There are—" She stopped, because she had been about to say, "There are things about me that you do not know," and she had remembered abruptly what those things were. The things she had not told him. The things she had been carrying, not in her reticule, but deeper, in the part of herself that she had kept behind walls even as every other wall had come down. The thing that had happened 3 years ago, that had nothing to do with finances and everything to do with why 6 seasons had produced nothing and why she flinched, very slightly, at certain kinds of male attention, and why the wallflower position, the unremarkable gown, the art of disappearance had felt like necessity rather than choice. The thing she had promised herself she would never need to say. John Blackwell was watching her face. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly. "What is it?" She looked at him. She opened her mouth, and the door at the end of the hallway opened, and Mr. Kemp appeared with an expression that Evangeline had learned, over 2 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays, meant the kind of urgent business that did not wait, and said, "Your Grace, there is a gentleman here. He says his name is Calloway. He says—" Mr. Kemp paused, with the look of someone delivering news they find personally distasteful. "He says he has information to sell, about Miss Ashworth. A beat. About 3 years ago." The hallway went absolutely silent. Evangeline felt the cold move through her, not the social chill of public humiliation, but the deep, seismic cold of a secret in motion, of the thing she had carried alone for 3 years, and now arriving at the door of the one house she had not been able to keep it away from. She looked at Blackwell. His face was utterly unreadable. "Send him to the study," he said to Kemp, without looking away from her. "Tell him to wait." Kemp withdrew. Blackwell looked at Evangeline for a long, long moment, in the amber afternoon light, in the fog-thickened quiet, with the whole enormous, unresolved weight of everything they had been building, and everything she had not told him, and everything that was now standing in his study waiting to be sold. "Whatever it is," he said quietly, "I would rather hear it from you." Evangeline closed her eyes. She thought of her father speaking in a room that had already decided. She opened her eyes. She began to speak. The study of Ashenmore House was a room that did not apologize for itself. Dark paneling, deep leather chairs, a desk of such commanding proportions that lesser men would have looked diminished behind it. Blackwell did not look diminished behind it. He looked, if anything, more himself. The architecture of the room and the architecture of the man in such precise agreement that Evangeline wondered, not for the first time, whether he had designed it deliberately or whether powerful men simply accumulated environments that reflected them. She was not sitting. Neither was he. Calloway had been sent to wait in the anteroom, a decision Blackwell had made with 3 words and a look that had caused Mr. Kemp to withdraw with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that certain rooms needed to be empty before certain conversations could occur. The fire was lit. Outside, the November fog had thickened to the consistency of wool, pressing against the windows, muffling the sounds of the street until London felt very far away, and this room felt like the only room in the world. Evangeline stood beside the fireplace with her hands folded in front of her, not in the pleasant social folding of a woman at a drawing-room gathering, but in the deliberate, grounding clasp of someone who needed something to hold. She had not begun yet. She was finding the beginning. Blackwell waited. This was, she had come to understand, one of his most formidable qualities. The capacity to wait without filling silence with sound, without the fidgeting impatience that most people expressed when they wanted something. He could wait the way stone waited, the way winter waited, with the absolute certainty that time would eventually deliver what was owed. 3 years ago, she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided in the 10 seconds between the hallway and this room that she would say it steadily, because the only thing worse than saying it would be saying it badly. I was 21. It was my 3rd season. My father was still alive. Well, still walking, though the illness had begun to show itself by then, though none of us had named it yet. She looked at the fire rather than at him. A gentleman was introduced to me at the Pembridge rout. His name was Mr. Roland Ashby. He was the nephew of Viscount Hadley, not wealthy in himself, but connected, which my mother considered sufficient. He was attentive, considerably more attentive than I was accustomed to. She paused. Shawnee, I was not experienced in attentiveness, she said. I had spent 2 seasons being unremarkable by design, and suddenly there was a man who appeared to find me remarkable, who sought me out at every gathering, who wrote, who sent notes, who seemed to see the thing that you said at the Harcastle ball, the not what she appears to be. She drew a breath. I was not wise enough, at 21, to understand that some men seek out precisely that quality, because a woman who has not been seen is grateful, is more easily. She stopped. Blackwell had not moved. She could feel his attention on her like a physical weight, concentrated, undeflected. He was not what he appeared to be, she said. He was in considerable debt. He had obligations of a nature that required capital urgently, and he had identified my father's estate as not wealthy but solvent, and my father as a man whose affection for his daughter might be leveraged into an accelerated arrangement. She looked at the fire. He pursued the appearance of a courtship. He maneuvered, very skillfully, a series of situations in which we were briefly, technically, unsupervised. A garden terrace, a library at a house party, a corridor at the wrong moment. Another pause. Nothing occurred. I want to be clear about that. Nothing occurred. I understand, Blackwell said quietly. But something was seen. Or rather, she turned from the fire and looked at him directly, because she was going to say this part precisely, and she needed to see his face when she said it. Something was arranged to appear as though it had been seen. Mr. Ashby had a friend, a man named Calloway, who was present on each occasion, who could testify, if called upon, that the Viscount's nephew and Miss Ashworth had been observed in compromising proximity. Not ruined, the claim was never explicit enough for that, because explicit claims can be disproved. Merely suggested, implied. The kind of whisper that does not need proof because it does not make a specific enough claim to be specifically refuted. She held Blackwell's gaze. He came to my father, she said. Ashby, with Calloway's testimony available as a threat and a marriage proposal as the alternative. My father, her voice for the first time, showed the strain of what she was carrying. My father was already unwell, though we were still not naming it. He was frightened for me. He could see what the whisper would do, and deployed in the right rooms. He was about to agree. She stopped. And? Blackwell's voice was very careful. And I told him not to. She straightened. The same straightening she had performed in the Harcastle ballroom, the reaching for the spine of herself. I told my father that Roland Ashby would receive nothing from our family, that if Calloway's testimony was deployed anywhere, I would produce documentation. I had kept every note Ashby had sent me, every communication, everything, because I have always kept things that would demonstrate the systematic nature of the pursuit. That would make it very clear that this was not an accidental compromising, but a deliberate, orchestrated scheme. She paused. I told Ashby that I would ruin him before he ruined me, and that I would do it without hesitation, and he should consider very carefully whether he believed me. A silence. He believed you, Blackwell said. He withdrew the proposal, left London within the fortnight. She exhaled. But Calloway? She glanced toward the anteroom door. Calloway still has whatever he witnessed, or whatever he is prepared to say he witnessed. He has been... I believe Deverell found him. I believe Deverell went looking for anyone with a reason to speak against me and found, in Calloway, a man who had been denied his payment 3 years ago and was willing to try again through a different avenue. Blackwell was quiet for a long moment. The documentation you mentioned, he said. Ashby's notes. I have them. Here, at Ashworth House, in a locked box that has not left my possession since the fortnight after Ashby left London. She looked at him steadily. I told you I keep my most important things close. Something passed across his face. Several things moving quickly, the way weather moves across open water. She watched them and could not fully name them, except that none of them were the things she had feared most. Not disgust, not the particular withdrawal of a man recalibrating a woman's value downward, not the cold retrenchment she had braced herself against. What she saw instead was something that looked considerably like fury, not at her. Deverell knew, he said. His voice was very controlled. This was not opportunistic. He found Calloway specifically. I believe so. After the ball, after your letter. He stood. She had not seen him stand with that quality before. The contained, purposeful energy of a man who had made a decision and was now simply implementing it, and as all his decisions appeared to be implemented, without theatrics and without delay. He could not attack me directly after the conversation we had. His jaw was tight, so he assembled a longer attack. Through you. Yes. He moved to the door of the anteroom, stopped, turned back to her. Miss Ashworth. His voice was different again, the underneath register, the one that required careful handling. What you have just told me, the manner in which you handled Ashby, the documentation, He paused. The refusal. She waited. You were 21 years old, he said, alone, with an unwell father and a mother who was frightened. Yes. And you faced down a blackmailer. I faced down a coward who depended on the belief that women in my position could not afford resistance, she said. I simply disabused him of that belief. The gray eyes held hers. You are, he said quietly, the most formidable person I have encountered in 31 years of encountering people. Evangeline opened her mouth, closed it, felt something warm and inconvenient move through her chest, with complete disregard for the severity of the situation. "There is a man in your anteroom," she said, "who is about to sell a story to Lord Deverell." "Yes," Blackwell agreed. "There is." He opened the anteroom door. Mr. Calloway was a small man in the way that men who have spent their lives making themselves useful to larger men are small. Not in stature, which was average, but in presence which had been compressed by decades of occupying the background. See, he sat in the anteroom chair with the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone accustomed to readiness, to being prepared to spring into whatever usefulness was required. He looked up when Blackwell entered. He looked up further, and with a rapid recalibration of expression, when Evangeline entered behind him. Blackwell sat behind the study desk. Evangeline took the chair to his left, not behind him, not at the periphery, but level. She saw Calloway register this arrangement and reassess. "Good," she thought. "Mr. Calloway," Blackwell said. His voice was the voice she had heard him use with Crow, the man of business, when an error had been found. Not raised, not theatrical, but with a quality of absolute certainty in it, like bedrock. "You have information you wish to sell." Calloway's eyes moved between them. "Your Grace," he said. Yes. Information pertaining to a matter of some delicacy, concerning a lady of your acquaintance." "I am aware of what it pertains to," Blackwell said. "I am also aware of the nature of your connection to Mr. Roland Ashby, and to Lord Deverell." He let that sit for a moment. "I should like you to consider carefully the situation you are currently in." Calloway shifted. "I don't know what. You are in the study of the Duke of Ashenmore," Blackwell said, "having presented yourself voluntarily at the instigation of Lord Deverell for the purpose of selling testimony about a lady who is under the protection of this household." He paused. "The testimony you intend to sell is either fabricated, in which case you are exposing yourself to significant legal liability, or relates to events in which you participated in a scheme of deliberate entrapment for financial gain, in which case you are exposing yourself to a different and equally significant legal liability." Another pause. "Either way, you have walked through my door and placed yourself, entirely of your own volition, in a position from which the only available exits are ones I control." The small man had gone considerably smaller. Evangeline watched Calloway with the quiet, cataloging attention she had been born with. She watched him calculate. She watched him find that the calculation did not produce a favorable result. She watched the particular deflation of a man who had expected to be in the position of power, and found, on arrival, that the geometry of the room was entirely different from what he had anticipated. "Lord Deverell," Calloway said, with the slightly desperate pivot of a man reassigning his loyalties in real time, "told me that that Miss Ashworth was—" "Lord Deverell," Blackwell said, "is not present. Lord Deverell did not accompany you into this room. Lord Deverell will not be present when whatever consequences attached to this conversation are distributed." He held Calloway's gaze. "I mention this in case it is relevant to your next sentence." A long pause. Calloway looked at Evangeline. She looked back at him with the steady, level gaze she had learned to keep in place when things were difficult. The gaze that had held at 21 and was holding now. "What do you want?" Calloway said. "A signed statement," Blackwell said, "attesting to the fabricated nature of the claims Lord Deverell intends to publish, attesting to your own role in the scheme involving Mr. Ashby 3 years ago, and attesting to the fact that you were approached by Lord Deverell specifically to construct a false narrative regarding Miss Ashworth." He paused. In exchange, I will not pursue the legal avenues available to me for your involvement in the original scheme. You will also receive, as a practical matter, sufficient funds to leave London and establish yourself somewhere that is not in Lord Deverell's immediate orbit. Calloway stared. You are paying me, he said slowly. I am offering you a dignified exit from a situation you should not have entered, Blackwell said. The distinction matters. The payment is not for the statement. I will obtain the statement regardless. The payment is for the expedition. Another pause. Then Calloway nodded. The nod of a small man accepting the geometry of a room he could not rearrange. Mr. Kemp was summoned. The statement was drafted with Mr. Kemp's legal efficiency. Calloway signed it, received a sealed envelope which he did not open in their presence, and was escorted from Ashenmore House with the quiet thoroughness that characterized all of the Duke's household operations. The study door closed. Evangeline sat in the chair to the left of the desk and looked at the fire and let the silence settle around her like the fog outside. Not oppressive, but encompassing. The world temporarily reduced to its essentials. It is not over, she said. Deverell will find another avenue. Yes, Blackwell agreed. He was still at the desk, had not moved to a more casual position, which she understood meant he was still in the place where he made decisions, still in the mode of a man who had something to settle. He will. He paused. Unless the avenue becomes sufficiently complicated to make the effort not worth his investment. She looked at him. And what, she said carefully, would complicate the avenue sufficiently? He looked at her across the width of the desk, across the autumn light and the fire's warmth and the 2 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays and the letter and the ballroom and everything that had been built, incrementally, in the spaces between the official purposes of their arrangement. Miss Ashworth, he said, Evangeline. The use of her given name, the first time, precise and deliberate as everything he did, landed in the room with the weight of a thing that cannot be unsaid. I spoke in the hallway of a third option, he said. You did. I spoke of it as a tactical solution and then immediately retracted that framing. You did. I should like to propose it again, he said, with the framing it deserves, which is... He paused. The pause had in it the quality she had heard once before. See, when he had said, I find that your presence is something I am aware of on the other days. The quality of a man encountering a territory for which his existing maps were insufficient. Which is that I have spent 31 years building things that were worth building and finding, consistently. That the building was something I did alone. That it required a precision and a consistency that most people found exhausting or intimidating or simply not worth the engagement. He met her gaze. I have spent 2 months finding that it is neither exhausting nor intimidating to be understood by someone. I have found, rather, that it is alarming, she offered softly. The almost smile. Yes, he said. Precisely that. She rose from the chair. Not because she had decided to, not with the deliberate, unreasoned decision-making that governed most of her actions, but because the distance between the chair and the desk had become, suddenly and irrevocably, too much distance. She stood before the desk. He rose. They were standing as they had stood in the parlor of Ashworth House on a gray October morning, at a distance that was not the room's full width, and was not convention, and was, instead, exactly the distance of intention. My father spoke in a room that had already decided, she said, and you wrote a letter that might never have served any purpose. And I carried it in my reticule for 3 weeks without knowing why. She held his gaze. I think we have been working toward the same point from different distances. He reached out, slowly, with the deliberate, measured quality of everything he did, and took her hand, but not her gloved hand, her bare hand, her right hand, which had set down its work and was now simply present in a warm study in fog-bound November London, held by the careful, certain grip of a man who, she understood, did not hold things he was not prepared to keep. I am not a romantic man, he said. I will not pretend to be one. I am precise and I am exacting, and I have, on various occasions, been described as cold, which I believe is the word people use for contained. I know precisely what you are, she said. I know, he said softly. That is the point. She looked up at him, the strong-boned face, the gray eyes that held their weather, the slight imperfection of the bruise from Deverell's fist that was still fading at his temple. And she thought, this is what it looks like when someone is not asking you to be smaller. There are things I require, if this is what we are doing, she said. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was conducting its now customary rebellion beneath her composure. Name them. I will not be a decoration, she said. I will not be managed or overlooked or reduced to the width of a ballroom wall. I have opinions about Valette's correspondence and your Northumberland estate accounts and the water rights dispute in Venice, and at least 40 other subjects, and I intend to have them allowed. I would be disappointed, he said, by any other arrangement. I will also... She stopped, because the next thing was harder, and she looked at their joined hands for a moment before looking back up. I will need time, not for the decision. The decision is made. She felt the truth of this as she said it, with the quiet certainty of a thing that has been true for longer than it has been acknowledged. But for the Ashby matter, the things that made certain kinds of closeness feel unsafe, I will need as much time as is necessary, he said. No hesitation, no negotiation. She breathed. You said that the same way you said accuracy matters more than speed. The almost smile deepened, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, but she could read him now, and she saw it clearly. The principle applies, he said. Outside, November fog pressed against the windows of Ashenmore House. Somewhere below, a clock was striking the hour. The fire settled. In the anteroom, the chair where Calloway had sat was empty. Caius Remington Blackwell, the 6th Duke of Ashenmore, raised Evangeline Constance Ashworth's bare hand to his lips. The gesture precise, deliberate, containing everything that a man like him put into the things he chose to do, and pressed his mouth to her fingers. She felt it through her whole body like a struck chord. Neither of them spoke. There was, for the moment, nothing that needed to be said. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post on the 14th of November. It was brief. Blackwell was constitutionally incapable of excess, even in announcements, and factual, and it detonated across London society with the force of something considerably less restrained than its language suggested. The Duke of Ashenmore requests the honor of announcing his betrothal to Miss Evangeline Constance Ashworth, daughter of the late Sir Edmund Ashworth and Lady Ashworth of Somerset. The families have been long connected. To 4 words that contained everything. Her father's courage, and Blackwell's father's ruin, and the 30-year debt paid forward into a letter written for a dying man and carried in a reticule by his daughter, and read aloud to a room that was still talking about it 6 weeks later. Evangeline read the announcement at the breakfast table in Ashworth House. Her mother sat across from her, holding her own copy of the paper with both hands. "Evie," her mother said. "Mama." "The Duke of Ashenmore." "Yes." Her mother set the paper down. She looked at her daughter across the breakfast things, the slightly chipped cups, the modest rack of toast, the morning light coming thin and gray through the Ashworth House windows. "Your father," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. She would have had something extraordinary to say about this. "He would have said it was inevitable," Evangeline said, "and then he would have claimed some credit for it, and he would have been correct." Her mother laughed, the real laugh, the one that did not appear often enough anymore, the one that remembered happier rooms. She pressed her hand to her mouth to contain it, and then did not bother containing it, and the laugh filled the modest breakfast room of Ashworth House with a warmth that the cold hearths could not provide. The ton reacted, predictably, with the comprehensive fascination of a society that had been deprived of genuine entertainment. The letters of congratulation were numerous. The calls were more numerous. Lady Harcastle, apparently now considering herself the origin point of the entire narrative, she, on the grounds that it had occurred at her ball, held a celebratory dinner and talked about it for 3 weeks. Miss Georgiana Webb sent a note of such genuine warmth that Evangeline read it twice. Lord Deverell was not seen in society for a fortnight following the announcement. When he reappeared, he was quieter than his previous form, which Evangeline attributed partly to Blackwell's fist and partly to the knowledge that Calloway's signed statement was in the possession of Blackwell's solicitors and would remain there, available for deployment, indefinitely. She did not feel triumph at his diminishment. She felt rather the particular exhaustion of someone who has been prepared for a fight that has been postponed rather than cancelled. Who knows that men like Deverell do not transform. They merely redirect, and who intends to remain appropriately watchful. She mentioned this to Blackwell. "Noted," he said, with the precision she had come to understand, meant I have already accounted for this. "He will be watched." "By whom?" A pause that told her the question had an answer he was choosing whether to give. "You are not the only person in London who has suffered Deverell's particular variety of cruelty," he said finally. "He has accumulated enemies more quietly than he knows. I have had certain conversations." She looked at him. "Caius," she said. His given name, which she had begun using in private and which produced every time that fractional softening. "Are you conducting a campaign against Lord Deverell?" "I'm ensuring," he said carefully, "check that the appropriate people have the appropriate information." That is a very precise way of saying yes. The almost smile. She let it go. She was, she had discovered, more willing to let certain things go when she trusted the person letting them in. This was a new experience. She was learning its shape. The weeks that followed had their own particular texture. The betrothal changed the nature of their proximity, made it official, gave it a name, provided the ton with a story that satisfied the appetite for narrative, and therefore, mercifully, reduced the scrutiny. They could be seen together without it being remarked upon. They could be seen together without being seen at all, which was an entirely different and considerably more valuable freedom. She continued the translation work. This was her own insistence. Valette's correspondence was ongoing, and the Contessa de Miraval's water rights dispute had developed a fascinating new complication involving a disputed mill, and Evangeline found she was not remotely ready to stop, Blackwell had not suggested she should. He had, in fact, begun bringing her correspondence that had nothing to do with the continental properties. Letters from the Northumberland estate managers that contained agricultural questions she had no professional background in and found she could not stop herself from researching. She had presented him, one Tuesday in late November, with a 3-page analysis of drainage systems in northern English estates, based on a text she had found in the library. He had read it in its entirety, asked 4 precise questions, and then looked at her with the expression that was no longer only almost a smile. "The Northumberland estate manager," he said, "is named Greystone. He has been there for 20 years and is extremely competent, and will almost certainly find your analysis both useful and infuriating." Why infuriating? Because he will not have thought of it himself, and he will be unable to dismiss it on grounds of professional inexperience, because the analysis is correct. A pause. "I will send it to him this week." She felt the warm, complicated, entirely advisable. She had decided to stop calling it inadvisable, feeling move through her. "You are going to cause me significant trouble with Greystone," she said. "You will manage him," Blackwell said, with the certainty he brought to most pronouncements about her capabilities. She discovered, with some frequency, that certainty of that quality was a remarkable thing to stand near. There were harder days. The slow-building intimacy of their arrangement did not proceed without friction. They were both too honest and too precisely themselves for the frictionless version. They disagreed, on one occasion, with considerable heat, about the terms of the valet negotiation. Blackwell's instinct was to press the financial advantage. Evangeline's was that pressing it would cost more in goodwill than it gained in capital, that valet's cooperation was worth more than the margin. The argument lasted 40 minutes and ended eventually, with Blackwell sitting back in the library chair and looking at her with the expression of a man revising an equation and finding the revision improves the result. "You are right," he said. "I know," she said. He revised the offer. Valet accepted. The Loire property was secured at slightly less than the maximum possible price, and with a warmth of correspondence that Blackwell, who understood the long-term value of relationships, acknowledged was worth considerably more. He did not make a ceremony of acknowledging she had been right. He simply acted on it, which she found more satisfying than ceremony would have been. She was right about other things and wrong about others. She misjudged one of the Italian lawyers, read him as sentimental when he was in fact purely strategic, which cost a week of negotiation. She told Blackwell immediately when she understood her error, with the directness that had always been her instinct, and was becoming, in this context, something that felt like safety rather than vulnerability. So he was wrong, she discovered, about people in the specific way that extremely precise men are wrong about people. He understood systems and structures and the rational components of motivation with perfect clarity, and occasionally missed the irrational components entirely. She had learned to watch for this gap and cautiously to point at it. He had learned to listen when she did, which she considered an achievement of considerable significance. The bridging of two solitudes, she thought sometimes, watching him work at the desk while she worked at the reading table, the fire between them, the fog or frost, or occasional thin winter sunshine beyond the library windows. Two people who had made themselves self-sufficient and are now learning what it costs and what it gives to need another person. December. And the season had wound down to its winter pace. Fewer balls, more intimate dinners, the ton dispersing to country estates for Christmas, The great machinery of London society cycling into its quieter register. Ashenmore House was preparing for Christmas with the efficient, understated thoroughness that characterized all its operations. Greenery appeared on the banisters. The smell of wood smoke deepened through the rooms. A tree, a German fashion that was becoming increasingly adopted, appeared in the hall, dressed with such geometric precision that Evangeline concluded Blackwell had supervised it personally, or had given Kemp very specific instructions. She had told him about Ashby, not the political, strategic version she had given him in the study with Calloway waiting in the anteroom. That version had been accurate but armored, delivered in the register of a woman presenting evidence rather than a woman speaking from the interior of her own experience. She had told him the real version on an evening in late November, when they had been sitting in the library past the hour when she should have left, the candles burning low, the fire reduced to embers, and the words had arrived not because she had planned them, but because the room and the hour and the company had made them possible. She had told him about the garden terrace at the Forsyth house party, the specific chill of understanding what was being orchestrated, the conversation with her father, his frightened eyes, his willingness to accept the lesser harm to prevent the larger one, the love in it and the helplessness in it, and how she had hated both in that moment and loved him more than she had words for. She had told him about the moment she had looked at Ashby and felt something crystallize. Not courage exactly, not the performed courage of a woman knowing she is being observed and must acquit herself well, but something colder and more fundamental. The refusal, the absolute cellular refusal to be the thing the scheme required her to be. Blackwell had listened. He had not interrupted. He had not offered the consolations she had braced herself against, the reassurances that she need not have worried, the minimizings, the discomfort of a man who found the subject difficult and was communicating that difficulty through the architecture of his response. He had listened the way he waited, with absolute presence, without deflection. When she finished, the embers had reduced further and the room was very dark and very quiet. "The refusal," he said. His voice was different again. The register she heard most rarely, the one furthest beneath the surface. Do you find—" He paused. She waited, recognizing the quality of his search for words. "When I took your hand," he said, "in the study, was that—" "No," she said, "immediately, because it was immediately true. That was not—" She found her own words. "You asked. Everything you do. I have come to understand that everything you do is a question waiting for a response. You do not assume. You do not proceed without the equivalent of permission, whether it is spoken or demonstrated." She paused. "That is, I did not know, and before you, that was something a man could do consistently. I had seen it performed. I had not seen it simply be." In the dark, she felt rather than saw the shift in him. "My mother," he said, and this was something he had not offered before. The door to his own interior opened with the same deliberate care that everything he did carried. Was a woman who was not asked, by anyone, in any matter. A pause. "My father was not a cruel man. He was simply a man for whom the question did not present itself, for whom the right to proceed was assumed." He stopped. "I watched her navigate that absence for 15 years. I concluded, very young, that there was a kind of violence in assumptions that was no less damaging for being bloodless. The embers, the dark. Caius," she said softly. "We are going to be all right," she said. "Aren't we?" Not a question, quite. More the spoken version of a thing she had known for several weeks and had been waiting for the right moment to give voice to. A pause. "Yes," he said. The word was simple and unornamented, and carried the full weight of a man who did not say things he did not mean. "I believe we are." She reached through the dark and found his hand. Christmas Eve. The Ashworth household had been invited to spend the holiday at Ashenmore House, an invitation extended to Lady Ashworth with such matter-of-fact courtesy that Evangeline's mother had accepted it before the social implications had fully assembled themselves, and had spent the subsequent 3 days in a condition of alternating delight and terror. The house, in its Christmas preparation, had a different quality than its everyday formality. Warmer, the geometric precision of the tree in the hall somehow charming rather than austere. The smell of pine and beeswax candles mixing with the library's permanent wood smoke into something that Evangeline's memory was already, she could feel it, beginning to lay down as the scent of safety. On Christmas Eve afternoon, Blackwell summoned her to the study. Not urgently, not with the quality of Kemp appearing with difficult news, but quietly, a note sent upstairs that said only when you have a moment, and contained in those 4 words, the particular consideration of a man who understood that a woman was not, by definition, available simply because a man wished her to be. She found him at the desk. He was holding a letter. Not a business letter. She could read the difference now in his posture, in the way he held it. He looked up when she entered. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He placed the letter on the desk and turned it so she could see the handwriting on the exterior. Her father's handwriting. She went very still. "It arrived this morning," Blackwell said. "From Greystone, my Northumberland estate manager. He found it in the estate office, in a folio of correspondence from 3 years ago, misfiled. It is addressed to me." He paused. "It appears your father wrote to me some months before his death, and the letter was somehow not delivered. Greystone found it when he was reorganizing the files in response to your drainage analysis." A pause. "Your drainage analysis is responsible for finding this letter. I thought you should know that." She looked at the envelope. "May I?" "It is addressed to me," he said. "But I think he intended it for both of us, though he did not know that at the time." He held her gaze. "If you would prefer to read it privately, I understand." She shook her head. He opened it. He read it slowly, which was not his customary pace for correspondence, which told her that the reading was not for information retrieval, but for something else. Then he set it on the desk between them, and she read it too. Sir Edmund Ashworth's handwriting had the quality of a man whose hands were beginning to tremble, the letters slightly uneven, the lines not quite straight, but the voice behind them completely, entirely him. "Your Grace, I write this knowing I may not be well enough to post it before the circumstance I am writing about resolves itself in one direction or another. But my daughter tells me I should say the things that need saying while I am able to say them, and she is, as she has always been, correct. You wrote to me last spring with a generosity I did not expect and did not deserve in any transactional sense. You said my family's difficulties were the result of misfortune rather than mismanagement, and you were right. But what struck me was not that you were right, but that you considered it worth saying. That you understood the distinction between a man's circumstances and a man's character. This is a rarer quality than it should be. I am writing to tell you that my daughter, Evangeline, is the finest person I have had the honor of knowing. I do not say this as a father who is blind to his child's faults. She is obstinate and occasionally ruthless when she believes she is correct. She is usually correct, which does not simplify matters, and entirely incapable of passing an interesting problem without engaging it, regardless of whether the engagement is convenient. But she sees truly. She is kind where kindness is warranted and immovable where immovability is required. She has never asked for anything except to be understood. I believe she has spent her whole life waiting for someone who is equipped to do so. I do not know if this letter will ever reach you, or if it does, whether it will be relevant. I am writing it because I have lived long enough to understand that the connections between people that matter are rarely the ones society arranges, and I have a suspicion, based on nothing I could defend in a court of law, that the connection between your family and mine is not finished. She carries things close, my Evangeline. The important things. Watch for that. Yours respectfully, Sir Edmund Ashworth. The study was very quiet. Evangeline looked at her father's uneven handwriting and felt grief and love and the particular complicated gratitude of a person who has been, at a crucial moment, accurately described by someone who loved them well. She could not speak. Blackwell was quiet beside her. After a moment, he reached across the desk, the same slow, deliberate reach, and placed his hand over hers. He knew, he said softly. Somehow he knew. He was always... She stopped, tried again. He saw between things, like you do. He said it was a family trait. She looked up. Her eyes were full. She did not apologize for it. He said my greatest gift. He was right, Blackwell said simply. She looked at him across the desk, in the Christmas Eve candlelight of Ashenmore House, with her father's letter between them and the whole enormous weight of everything they had come through. The ballroom and the letter and the fog-drenched study and Calloway and Deverell and the dark library and the handed grief of their different solitudes. And she understood that the life she had been building, without knowing she was building it, in 3 weeks of carrying a letter in her reticule, had arrived at the place it had been heading. She turned her hand under his and held it. He said, "Watch for what I carry close," she said. "I have been watching," Blackwell said, "since the moment you reached into your reticule." The wedding was small, at Lady Ashworth's request and Evangeline's relief. 30 guests in the chapel at Ashenmore House on a morning when the late winter had briefly, graciously, agreed to resemble early spring. Blackwell stood at the altar with the composure that he brought to everything, and Evangeline came to him in a gown of deep ivory silk that was not unremarkable. That was in fact the most beautiful thing she had ever worn, and that she had selected with the specific knowledge that she was done with sage green. She carried in her left hand a small posy of white flowers. In her right, held close against her side, she carried nothing. She did not need to. The things she carried now were different from the things she had carried alone. They were shared, distributed, held between 2 pairs of hands, rather than pressed against a single sternum in a dark hallway. This was new. This was, she was discovering, what it felt like to put something down, not because you had lost it, but because someone else had agreed to carry it with you. Blackwell took her hand at the altar. He looked at her with the gray, weather-containing eyes, and the weather in them today was not the overcast of a man containing everything, but the particular quality of cleared sky that comes after a long storm has finally, completely passed. She thought of her father saying she has spent her whole life waiting for someone equipped to understand her. She thought of a letter in black wax carried in a reticule waiting for its moment. She thought of a ballroom and a potted fern and a voice saying, "You are not what you are pretending to be." And she understood that the whole of it, every season, every unremarkable gown, every carefully constructed disappearance, had been a door she was walking through, not a room she was trapped in. She smiled at the Duke of Ashenmore. He smiled back, not the almost smile, not the fractional barely there softening, but the real version, the one she had not seen before, and which transformed his face with the devastating completeness of something that has been held back for a very long time and is finally, entirely, released. The chaplain began to speak. Outside the chapel windows, the late winter light was extraordinary. But even as the vows were spoken, in the back pew of the Ashenmore Chapel, unannounced and uninvited, sat a woman in a dark traveling cloak, whose face Blackwell had gone pale upon glimpsing. A woman no one else in the room recognized, who watched the ceremony with an expression that was not happiness and not grief, but something older and more dangerous than either. She left before the final blessing, but she left a letter on the pew, sealed in black wax, with a phoenix rising from a coronet, the Ashenmore seal,